More than a century after the Titanic sank, deep-sea explorers descend into the silent remains of engine room number 6, a place untouched since the night of the disaster. Among the twisted steel and frozen machinery, they uncover tools, uniforms, and haunting signs of the engineers who stayed behind to keep the ship's lights burning as it went down. Each discovery reveals a story of duty, sacrifice, and humanity in the face of certain death. What lies preserved in that iron tomb, Bridges 1912, and now a timeless reminder of courage beneath the waves. These brave men knew they would never see another sunrise, yet they remained at their posts, ensuring power flowed to the wireless room and lifeboats. What final messages did they leave behind in those last desperate hours? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her headset as the research vessel Meridian cut through the North Atlantic swells, her weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. At 58, she had spent 3 decades exploring the ocean's deepest secrets, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. 2 miles beneath their hull rested the most famous shipwreck in history, and today they would venture into a space no human eyes had seen since the 15th of April 1912. Sonar confirms we're directly above the debris field, called James Morrison from the navigation station. The marine archaeologist's Scottish accent carried the weight of reverence that had settled over the entire crew. At 62, Morrison had dedicated his career to preserving maritime history, but the Titanic held special meaning. His great-grandfather had been a stoker on ships of that era, men who understood the sacred bond between engineer and engine. The brass nameplate, recovered from their preliminary survey, gleamed under the laboratory lights. Joseph Bell, chief engineer. The metal had survived 112 years of crushing darkness, its letters still crisp and proud. Sarah traced the engraving with her finger, feeling the connection across time. This man had been responsible for the ship's mechanical heart, and his final resting place waited below. Temperatures dropping, reported pilot Marcus Rodriguez from the submersible bay. The 35-year-old had the steady nerves required for deep-sea operations, but even he seemed subdued by their mission. Water's calm, though. Conditions are perfect for descent. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the sonar display, showing the massive outline of Titanic's hull. The ship lay broken in 2 sections, the stern twisted and scattered, but the forward section remained remarkably intact. Engine room No. 6 was located in the forward section, deep within the belly of the great ship. The room we're entering was the nerve center of Titanic's power, Morrison explained to the documentary crew recording their expedition. These men controlled the electrical systems that kept the lights burning, the wireless operating, and the pumps running. When the ship struck the iceberg, they became the last line of defense against complete darkness. The engineer's pocket watch, recovered from a previous expedition, sat in a place of honor on the research table. The timepiece had stopped at 2:17 a.m., marking the exact moment when the ship's power finally failed. Sarah imagined those final minutes, the engineers working frantically in rising water, their hands steady on controls that grew increasingly useless as the Atlantic claimed their domain. Dr. Chen called Communications Officer Lisa Park. "We're receiving final clearance from the Maritime Heritage Foundation. They've confirmed our permits for interior exploration." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. They weren't just explorers today. They were witnesses, archaeologists, and guardians of memory. The Foundation had granted unprecedented access to engine room number 6, based on her team's reputation for respectful preservation. "I want everyone to remember," Sarah addressed her crew. "We're not just documenting machinery. We're entering a memorial. These men chose to stay at their posts when they could have fought for the lifeboats. They kept the power flowing so others might live. We owe them reverence." The submersible Orpheus hung in its cradle, a marvel of modern engineering that would carry them into the past. Its titanium hull could withstand the crushing pressure 2 miles down, its cameras would capture images in stunning detail, and its robotic arms could handle delicate artifacts with surgical precision. Morrison opened the ship's engineering manual they had studied for months. Water damage had made portions illegible, but enough remained to understand the sophisticated systems these men had operated. Steam pressures, electrical loads, coal consumption rates. Every page spoke of professional competence and pride in their work. "Final systems check in 10 minutes. Rodriguez announced. ROV units are calibrated and ready for deployment. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, thinking of the families who had waited for news that would never come. Wives who had kissed their husbands goodbye at Southampton, children who had waved from the dock, parents who had raised sons to be engineers. All of them connected to this moment by threads of memory and loss. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, its surface giving no hint of the cathedral of twisted metal below. But Sarah knew that in less than an hour, they would be floating through corridors where heroes had walked, touching controls that brave hands had operated in their final moments. "Time to meet the engineers," she whispered, and gave the order to begin descent. The submersible Orpheus descended through layers of darkness, its lights carving a narrow cone through water that had remained undisturbed for over a century. Sarah Chen watched the depth gauge climb steadily. 500 feet, 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet. The pressure outside increased with each passing moment, but inside their titanium sphere, the three-person crew remained protected from the crushing weight of the Atlantic. "First visual contact in approximately 12 minutes, Rodriguez announced, his hands steady on the controls despite the magnitude of their descent. The young pilot had made dozens of deep-sea dives, but nothing compared to approaching the most famous shipwreck in history. Morrison adjusted the external cameras, their high-definition lenses capable of capturing details in the perpetual night of the deep ocean. "The ship's engineering manual indicates engine room number 6 should be intact," he said, consulting the water-damaged pages they had studied for months. The compartment was sealed and reinforced, designed to withstand significant pressure. At 2,000 feet, small particles began drifting past their viewport like underwater snow. Sarah recognized them immediately. The rusticles, iron-eating bacteria formations that had been slowly consuming the wreck for over a century. They gave the deep ocean an almost ethereal quality, as if they were descending through a cathedral of decay. "There," Rodriguez whispered, his voice filled with awe. The massive hull of RMS Titanic emerged from the darkness like a sleeping giant. Even broken and scarred by time, the ship retained an undeniable majesty. Sarah felt her breath catch as they approached the forward section where engine room number 6 lay hidden within the ship's steel embrace. "My God," Morrison breathed. "She's enormous." The submersible sonar painted a detailed picture of the wreck structure. The hull plating had buckled in several places, creating openings large enough for their ROV units to navigate. Most importantly, the section containing the engine rooms appeared structurally sound, protected by the ship's robust construction. "Bringing us to hover above the target area," Rodriguez announced, his movements precise and deliberate. "ROV deployment in 3 minutes. Sarah studied the external monitors, noting how the ship's steel had taken on an orange-brown patina from decades of corrosion. Yet beneath the rusticles and marine growth, the fundamental structure remained recognizable. Porthole frames, deck railings, and ventilation shafts all testified to the craftsmanship of Belfast shipbuilders who had taken pride in their work. "The breach is approximately 40 meters forward of our target," Morrison observed, consulting his charts. "We should be able to navigate the ROV through the main corridor and access engine room number 6 from the starboard side." The ship's engineering manual lay open beside him, its pages revealing the complex layout of pipes, cables, and machinery that had made Titanic one of the most advanced ships of her era. Every system had been carefully planned and installed by men who understood the critical importance of reliable power generation. "ROV launch in 60 seconds, Rodriguez called out. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and reverence that accompanied every significant archaeological discovery. They were about to enter a space that had been sealed since the night of the disaster, a time capsule containing the final moments of men who had chosen duty over survival. "Remember," she told her team, "we're not just exploring a wreck, we're entering a memorial." These engineers stayed at their posts when they could have abandoned them. They kept the power flowing so the wireless could send distress calls, and the lights could guide passengers to safety. The ROV Surveyor detached from Orpheus with a gentle thrum of electric motors. Its camera lights illuminated the hull as it approached the opening that would grant them access to the ship's interior. The robotic vehicle was equipped with the finest archaeological tools available: precision cameras, gentle manipulator arms, and sensors capable of detecting the smallest artifacts. "ROV is approaching the hull breach," Rodriguez reported, all systems nominal. Through the ROV's cameras, they watched as the entrance to Titanic's interior came into view. Twisted metal framed an opening that led into corridors where passengers and crew had walked more than a century ago. The ship's internal structure remained remarkably preserved, protected from the worst effects of corrosion by the enclosed environment. "We're going in," Sarah announced, her voice barely above a whisper. The ROV crossed the threshold, and suddenly they were inside the great ship. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that had once carried steam and power throughout the vessel. Everything was covered in a fine layer of sediment, but the fundamental structure remained intact. "Engine room No. 6 should be directly ahead," Morrison said, his excitement barely contained. "We're about to see something no human eyes have witnessed since the 15th of April 1912. The ROV surveyor's lights pierced the eternal darkness as it approached the entrance to engine room No. 6. Sarah Chen held her breath, watching the monitors as their robotic explorer prepared to cross into a space that had remained undisturbed for 112 years. The threshold ahead represented more than just physical passage. It was a gateway into the final hours of men who had faced death with unwavering courage. "ROV is positioned at the entrance," Rodriguez reported, his voice hushed with reverence. "All sensors indicate stable conditions inside the compartment." The camera revealed a heavy steel door, partially ajar, its frame twisted but intact. Beyond the opening lay shadows that had hidden their secrets since the ship's power failed in those final desperate minutes. Morrison leaned forward, studying every detail of the entrance as if trying to glimpse the ghosts of the men who had last passed through. "The door mechanism is consistent with standard marine engineering of the period," Morrison observed. "These compartments were designed to be sealed in emergencies, but someone deliberately left this one open. They wanted access maintained to the very end." Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. The engineers had kept their workplace accessible even as water rose around them, ensuring they could continue their vital work until the last possible moment. It spoke to a level of dedication that transcended personal safety. "Proceeding into engine room No. 6, Rodriguez announced as the ROV crossed the threshold. The interior revealed itself slowly as their lights swept across the space. Massive steam pipes ran along the ceiling, their brass fittings still gleaming despite decades of submersion. Control panels lined the walls, their gauges frozen at readings that told the story of the ship's final struggles. Everything remained exactly as it had been left, a perfectly preserved snapshot of that terrible night. "Dear God," Morrison whispered. In the center of the room, a coal shovel rested against a control panel, its wooden handle still gripped by skeletal fingers. The engineer who had wielded it had died at his post, his final act one of service rather than self-preservation. The sight struck the exploration team into stunned silence, the reality of their discovery suddenly overwhelming. "We need to document everything with the utmost care," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "This man deserves our respect and dignity." The ROV's cameras captured every detail as they slowly surveyed the compartment. Tools lay scattered across work surfaces where they had been hastily abandoned. A coffee cup sat half empty beside a logbook, its pages still legible after more than a century underwater. Personal effects revealed the humanity behind the heroism. A photograph tucked behind a gauge, a pocket Bible left open on a maintenance manual. "The preservation is remarkable," Morrison noted, his archaeological training taking over as he processed what they were seeing. "The sealed environment and cold water have created ideal conditions for preservation. We're looking at the most complete maritime archaeological site ever discovered." Rodriguez maneuvered the ROV deeper into the room, its lights revealing the sophisticated machinery that had powered one of the world's most advanced ships. Steam generators stood silent and cold, their fireboxes long extinguished. Electrical panels showed signs of the engineers' final desperate attempts to maintain power, with jury-rigged connections and improvised repairs visible throughout the system. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to a section of electrical wiring that had been hand-spliced with obvious skill. They were still trying to maintain power even as the ship was sinking. These modifications weren't part of the original design. Someone created these connections during the emergency. The evidence painted a picture of men who had refused to abandon their responsibilities even when faced with certain death. Every jury-rigged repair, every improvised solution, spoke to professional competence maintained under unimaginable pressure. These engineers had continued to practice their craft until the very end. The room layout matches the engineering manual perfectly, Morrison confirmed, consulting the water-damaged pages. Steam pressure gauges, electrical load indicators, coal feed mechanisms. Everything is exactly where it should be according to the ship's specifications. As the ROV continued its survey, more personal details emerged. A work jacket hung on a hook near the entrance, its pockets likely containing letters from home or personal mementos. A lunch pail sat unopened beside a workbench, its contents preserved as a reminder that this disaster had struck without warning during an ordinary watch rotation. "We're not just documenting machinery," Sarah reminded her team. "We're witnessing the final moments of men who chose their duty over their lives. This room is their monument, and we're the first people to honor their sacrifice in over a century." The weight of responsibility settled over them as they realized they were no longer just explorers or archaeologists. They had become guardians of memory, witnesses to heroism that deserved to be remembered and honored by future generations. April 10, 1912. Southampton Harbour buzzed with excitement as the largest ship ever built prepared for her maiden voyage. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell stood on the pier, his weathered hands gripping a letter fragment that would never reach its destination. At 47, Bell had spent his entire adult life in engine rooms, but nothing had prepared him for the marvel that was RMS Titanic. "Martha, my dearest," the letter began in his careful script. "By the time you read this, we shall be well across the Atlantic, and I will have seen the greatest engineering achievement of our age perform flawlessly. The ship is beyond anything I could have imagined." Bell folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. He would finish it during the voyage, adding details about the ship's performance that would fascinate his mechanically minded wife. She understood his passion for engines and boilers in a way that made their 23-year marriage a partnership of minds as well as hearts. Around him, his team of engineers prepared for departure with the methodical precision that defined their profession. These were not ordinary stokers or coal heavers, but skilled technicians responsible for the most advanced marine power plant ever constructed. Each man had earned his position through years of study and experience in the demanding world of steam engineering. William Harvey, the junior engineer at 28, checked his pocket watch nervously. This was his first voyage on a major passenger liner, and the responsibility weighed heavily on his young shoulders. His father had been a railway engineer, and William carried the family tradition of mechanical excellence with pride and determination. "Harvey," Bell called out, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades at sea. "Remember, this ship represents the pinnacle of British engineering. Every system, every gauge, every valve has been designed and tested by the finest minds in the industry. Our job is to prove their confidence was well placed." The letter fragment in Bell's pocket contained words he would never finish writing. The children must understand that their father serves something greater than himself. When a man takes responsibility for a ship's power, he accepts a sacred trust. The lives of every soul aboard depend upon our competence and dedication. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, made his final inspection of the engine spaces before departure. The young naval architect had poured his soul into Titanic's design, and the engine rooms represented the mechanical heart of his creation. Every pipe, every valve, every electrical connection had been carefully planned to ensure reliability and safety. "Mr. Bell," Andrews said, his Irish accent carrying genuine admiration, "I've designed many ships, but none with engine rooms as sophisticated as these. The redundancy built into these systems should handle any emergency we might encounter." Bell nodded respectfully. He had studied the ship's plans for months, memorizing every detail of the power plant that would drive them across the North Atlantic. The engineering was indeed remarkable. Separate electrical systems, multiple steam lines, and backup power sources that could maintain essential services even if primary systems failed. Young Harvey approached with the final equipment checklist. His hands shook slightly as he reported the results of their pre-departure inspection. Every gauge, every control, every safety system had been tested and verified. The engine rooms were ready to power the greatest ship in the world on her maiden voyage. "Sir," Harvey said to Bell, "all systems report normal operation. Steam pressure is steady, electrical loads are balanced, and coal bunkers are at maximum capacity." Bell smiled at the young man's thoroughness. Harvey reminded him of himself 30 years earlier, when he had first stepped aboard a passenger liner as a junior engineer. The same mixture of excitement and terror, the same determination to prove himself worthy of the responsibility placed upon him. The letter fragment would later be found in Bell's jacket, water-damaged but partially legible. "I have trained these young men well. They understand that engineering is not merely a profession, but a calling. When the time comes to prove themselves, I have complete confidence in their character and competence." As the ship's whistle signaled final preparations for departure, Bell gathered his team for their traditional pre-voyage meeting. They stood in the gleaming engine room, surrounded by machinery that represented the finest achievements of Edwardian engineering. Steam gauges showed perfect pressure, electrical panels displayed balanced loads, and coal feeders stood ready to maintain the fires that would drive them to New York. "Gentlemen," Bell addressed his engineers, "we sail today not just as crew members, but as guardians of every soul aboard this ship. Our work in these rooms will determine whether families reach their new homes safely, whether businessmen complete their journeys, whether dreams of a better life become reality." The men nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of their responsibility. They were engineers, trained to think in terms of steam pressure and electrical loads, but they never forgot that their true cargo was human hopes and aspirations. The ROV's lights swept across a section of engine room number 6 that defied everything the exploration team thought they knew about the Titanic's final moments. Sarah Chen stared at the monitor in amazement as the camera revealed an emergency lighting system that had never appeared in any of the ship's original blueprints or survivor accounts. "This is impossible," Morrison whispered, leaning closer to study the improvised electrical connections. "According to every historical record, the ship's power failed completely at 2:17 a.m. But look at this." The camera focused on a series of hand-spliced copper wires that snaked across the ceiling, connecting the main electrical panel to a jury-rigged lighting circuit. The work showed remarkable skill and ingenuity, with professional-grade connections that could only have been made by someone with extensive electrical knowledge. "They rebuilt the lighting system," Rodriguez observed, maneuvering the ROV for a better angle. "Someone took the time to reroute power from the emergency batteries to maintain illumination in critical areas." Sarah felt her understanding of the disaster shifting as she processed what they were seeing. The engineers hadn't simply maintained existing systems during the emergency. They had actively modified and improved them, creating solutions that extended the ship's operational capability far beyond its designed parameters. "The quality of this work is extraordinary," Morrison noted, his archaeological training evident as he examined each connection through the camera. "These aren't desperate, improvised repairs. This is skilled electrical work, performed under extreme pressure." The emergency lighting system told a story of men who had refused to accept the limitations of their circumstances. When the ship's primary power began failing, they had created alternatives. When standard procedures proved inadequate, they had invented new ones. Every splice, every connection represented a deliberate choice to fight against the inevitable. "Look here." Sarah directed Rodriguez to focus on a particular junction box. "They've rerouted power from 3 different sources to maintain current to this single circuit. This would have required intimate knowledge of the ship's electrical systems and the ability to calculate load distributions in their heads." The ROV continued its survey, revealing more evidence of the engineers' final heroic efforts. Tools had been positioned with obvious purpose near critical controls. Wrenches lay beside valves that had been operated manually when automatic systems failed. A coal shovel rested against the main steam gauge, suggesting someone had continued feeding the boilers by hand even as water rose around them. "The preservation is allowing us to see their final actions with unprecedented clarity," Morrison said, his voice filled with reverence. "These men didn't just stay at their posts. They actively worked to maintain ship operations until the very end." Rodriguez moved the ROV deeper into the compartment, where they discovered a maintenance station that had been completely reorganized during the emergency. Tools were arranged in a pattern that suggested systematic problem-solving rather than panicked activity. Spare parts had been sorted and positioned for quick access. Everything indicated calm. Professional competence maintained under unimaginable circumstances. "They turned this room into a battlefield command center," Sarah realized. "Look at how everything is positioned for maximum efficiency. They weren't just reacting to the emergency, they were managing it." The camera revealed a hand-drawn schematic pinned to a bulletin board, showing modifications to the electrical system that had never been documented in any official record. The drawing displayed the same professional quality found in the ship's original blueprints, complete with load calculations and safety margins written in a steady hand. Someone took the time to plan these modifications and document them properly, Morrison observed. Even knowing they were going to die, they maintained professional standards. The emergency lighting system extended throughout the compartment, with carefully planned routes that would have illuminated escape paths and critical control stations. The engineers had thought not only of their own needs, but of anyone else who might need to navigate the space during the disaster. "This changes everything we thought we knew about the ship's final hours," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. These men weren't just maintaining existing systems, they were innovating, creating solutions that didn't exist in the original design. Rodriguez positioned the ROV near a control panel where someone had jury-rigged a backup power supply for the ship's wireless equipment. The modification showed the same attention to detail and professional competence that characterized all their work, ensuring that distress calls could continue transmitting even after main power failed. They gave other ships more time to respond, Morrison realized. Every minute they kept that wireless operating increased the chances that rescue vessels could reach the scene in time to save lives. The evidence painted a picture of engineers who had transformed a sinking ship into a platform for heroism, using their technical skills to buy precious time for passengers and crew. Their jury-rig systems had extended the ship's operational life far beyond what anyone thought possible. The ROV's camera followed a bundle of copper wires that snaked through the overhead pipes like metallic veins, each strand carefully insulated and secured with professional precision. Sarah Chen realized they were looking at something extraordinary, a direct connection from Engine Room 6 to the ship's wireless room. Hand-spliced and maintained by engineers who understood that communication meant survival for everyone aboard. These connections bypassed the main electrical distribution system entirely, Morrison observed, his voice filled with growing amazement. Someone created a dedicated power line specifically for the wireless equipment. Rodriguez maneuvered the ROV to follow the wire bundle, revealing splice points where multiple connections had been joined together with the skill of a master electrician. Each junction showed evidence of careful planning and execution, with proper insulation and strain relief that would have taken considerable time to install correctly. This explains how the wireless kept transmitting for so long after the main power failed, Sarah said, pieces of the historical puzzle falling into place. The Carpathia received signals until almost 2:30 a.m., nearly 15 minutes after we thought all power was lost. The copper wire bundle told a story that no survivor account had ever captured. While passengers struggled with lifeboats on the deck above, engineers 2 decks below had been working frantically to maintain the one system that could bring help across the dark Atlantic. Every hand-twisted connection represented minutes of precious time that might mean the difference between rescue and disaster. "Look at the quality of these splices," Morrison marveled, studying the electrical work through the camera. "This isn't emergency repair work. This is master-level craftsmanship performed under extreme pressure." The ROV traced the wire bundle to a junction box that had been completely rewired during the emergency. The original factory connections had been abandoned in favor of a new routing system that drew power directly from the emergency batteries. Someone had calculated the electrical loads and designed a system that would maximize transmission time. They sacrificed lighting and other systems to keep the wireless operating, Rodriguez realized. Every amp of current flowing through these wires was power they couldn't use for anything else. Sarah felt the weight of their discovery settling over her. These engineers had made a calculated decision to prioritize communication over their own comfort and safety. In the darkness of a flooding ship, they had chosen to ensure that rescue ships could find the survivors rather than illuminate their own final moments. The wireless operators on duty that night were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, Morrison explained, consulting his historical records. Phillips went down with the ship, but Bride survived. He testified that they had power much longer than anyone expected, but he never knew why. The camera revealed more evidence of the engineers' desperate efforts to maintain communication. Additional wire bundles had been rerouted through alternate pathways, creating redundant connections that would continue functioning even if primary routes failed. The level of planning and foresight demonstrated remarkable professional competence. This changes our understanding of the rescue operation, Sarah realized. The Carpathia wasn't just lucky to receive the distress calls. These engineers bought enough transmission time to ensure multiple ships received accurate position information. Rodriguez followed the wire bundle to its terminus, near what had been the wireless room's power distribution panel. The connections showed signs of continuous maintenance and adjustment throughout the emergency, with multiple splice points indicating ongoing repairs as systems failed and were rerouted. Someone stayed with these connections until the very end, Morrison observed, noting the careful organization of spare wire and electrical components near the junction box. They were prepared to keep making repairs as long as the ship remained afloat. The discovery transformed their understanding of the disaster's timeline. Instead of a catastrophic power failure at 2:17 a.m., they were seeing evidence of managed power distribution that extended critical systems far beyond their designed operational limits. The engineers had essentially redesigned the ship's electrical system during the emergency. The Californian was only 19 miles away, Sarah said, her voice heavy with the implications. If they had maintained radio watch, these extra minutes of transmission time might have made all the difference. The copper wire bundle represented more than electrical engineering. It embodied hope maintained against impossible odds, professional dedication that transcended personal safety, and the understanding that their technical skills could mean survival for hundreds of people they would never meet. They turned their engine room into a communications hub, Rodriguez observed. Every system was subordinated to maintaining contact with the outside world. The ROV's lights illuminated junction boxes and wire runs that told the story of men who had refused to accept that technical limitations meant certain death. They had improvised, innovated, and persevered, using their knowledge to buy precious time for rescue operations that would ultimately save over 700 lives. The ROV's mechanical arm extended delicately toward a small object that had been carefully positioned behind one of the main steam gauges. Sarah Chen watched the monitor intently as the camera focused on what appeared to be a leather wallet, its contents protected by the waterproof material that had preserved them for over a century. "Steady now," Rodriguez whispered, his hands guiding the robotic manipulator with surgical precision. "Whatever's in there has been waiting 112 years to tell its story." The wallet opened slowly, revealing a family photograph that took Sarah's breath away. A young woman sat in a garden chair, her Victorian dress carefully arranged, while 3 children clustered around her. The oldest boy couldn't have been more than 10, the youngest a toddler barely able to stand. All 4 faces looked directly at the camera with the formal composure typical of early photography. "That's someone's family," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of sudden understanding. One of these engineers was looking at this picture during his final moments. The photograph was perfectly preserved, its sepia tones still clear despite decades underwater. Someone had taken great care to protect it, placing it in the waterproof wallet and positioning it where it could be easily seen during routine gauge readings. This wasn't just a keepsake. It was a daily reminder of what waited at home. "Look at the inscription on the back," Sarah directed as Rodriguez carefully turned the photograph. In careful script, someone had written, "My dearest Joseph, remember us always, your loving wife, Martha, and children Thomas, William, and little Sarah. Southampton, March 1912. The exploration team fell silent as the implications sank in. This was Chief Engineer Joseph Bell's family, the wife and children who had watched him board the greatest ship ever built, confident that his skills and experience would bring him safely home to them. The photograph represented hopes and dreams that would never be fulfilled. He was looking at their faces when he died, Rodriguez said, his voice barely audible. The ROV continued its careful exploration of the personal artifacts scattered throughout engine room number 6. Each item revealed another human story behind the technical expertise and professional dedication. A pocket Bible lay open beside a maintenance manual, its pages turned to Psalm 23. Someone had found comfort in familiar words during the ship's final hours. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Sarah read from the clearly visible text. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside still waters." Near the main electrical panel, they discovered a half-finished letter written on ship stationery. The handwriting was steady despite the circumstances, suggesting it had been composed during the early stages of the emergency when hope still remained for survival. "My darling Elizabeth," the letter began, "if you are reading these words, then God has called me home before I could return to your arms. Know that my final thoughts were of you and our unborn child. I pray that he will grow to be a man of honor and integrity, worthy of the Bell family name. Morrison's hands shook as he read the letter aloud to his colleagues. The courage it must have taken to write those words, knowing death was approaching but still thinking of his family's future. The ROV discovered more personal effects that painted a complete picture of the men who had worked in this space. A photograph of a young woman in a wedding dress was tucked behind a pressure gauge, carefully protected from the spray and condensation that characterized working engine rooms. Someone had been recently married, perhaps on his first voyage as a qualified engineer. "Look at this." Sarah pointed to a small wooden carving positioned near the coal scuttle. The ROV's camera revealed a miniature ship, carved with obvious skill and attention to detail. Initials were carved into the base. WH for my father, Master Shipwright of the Clyde. The carving represented a family tradition passed down through generations of shipbuilders and marine engineers. William Harvey had carried it as a reminder of his heritage and the craftsmen who had taught him his trade. Now it sat as a monument to skills and knowledge that had died with him in the cold Atlantic. "These aren't just artifacts," Morrison observed, his archaeological training helping him process the emotional weight of their discoveries. "They're shrines. These men arranged their most precious possessions where they could see them during their final hours. The family photograph, the pocket Bible, the wedding picture, the carved ship. Each item had been deliberately positioned by men who knew they were going to die but wanted their final moments to be surrounded by reminders of love, faith, and purpose. They had transformed a mechanical space into a memorial to the lives they were leaving behind. April 14, 1912, 11:40 p.m. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell felt the ship shudder beneath his feet as he completed his final log entry of the evening watch. The vibration was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent 30 years listening to the heartbeat of steam engines. Something had struck RMS Titanic, and the rhythm of her mighty machinery had changed. "Mr. Harvey," Bell called to his junior engineer, who was monitoring the electrical distribution panels. "Check all pressure readings immediately. Something's not right." The ship's log entry, written in Bell's careful script, would be among the last official records created aboard the vessel. 11:40 p.m. All systems operating within normal parameters. Steam pressure steady at 210 pounds per square inch. Electrical loads balanced across all generators. Coal consumption at projected rates for Atlantic crossing. Within minutes, the telegraph from the bridge began clattering with urgent messages. Captain Smith's orders were clear and terrifying. "Engine rooms report damage assessment immediately. Prepare for emergency power procedures." Bell's mind raced through the ship's design specifications as he organized his response. Titanic had been built with watertight compartments specifically to survive this type of emergency. The ship could remain afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded. His job was to ensure the power plant continued operating no matter what damage had occurred. "Harvey, get down to the lower levels and assess flooding in compartments 5 and 6, Bell ordered, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "Thomas, check all pump operations and prepare to redirect steam pressure to the bilge systems." The young engineers moved with practiced efficiency, their training taking over as they implemented emergency procedures they had drilled dozens of times. But nothing had prepared them for the reality of ice-cold Atlantic water rushing through holes in the ship's supposedly unsinkable hull. Bell opened the ship's engineering manual to the emergency procedures section, his finger tracing the carefully planned responses to various disaster scenarios. The designers had anticipated many possibilities, but the damage reports coming from below exceeded even their worst-case projections. "Sir," Harvey called up from the lower level, his voice strained with controlled panic. "Water is entering faster than the pumps can handle. Compartments 5 and 6 are flooding rapidly, and the water is beginning to spill over into 7. Bell felt his heart sink as he calculated the implications. If more than 4 compartments flooded, no engineering skill in the world could save them. But his responsibility wasn't just to save the ship. It was to maintain power for as long as possible, giving passengers and crew the maximum chance for survival. "All right, lads," Bell announced to his team, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades at sea. "We're going to lose the ship, but we're not going to lose our professionalism. Our job now is to keep the lights burning and the wireless transmitting until every lifeboat is away." The engineering manual contained detailed procedures for power management during catastrophic flooding. Bell had studied these pages countless times, but never imagined he would need to implement them. Every decision now carried life or death consequences for the 2,200 souls aboard. "We'll maintain steam pressure as long as possible," Bell explained to his men. "When the lower boiler rooms flood, we'll shut down those systems in sequence and concentrate power in the remaining generators. The passenger areas need lighting for evacuation, and the wireless needs power to call for help." Harvey returned from his damage assessment, his face grim. "The designer, Mr. Andrews, is in compartment 6. He says we have perhaps an hour and a half before the bow goes under. Maybe 2 hours if we're fortunate." Bell nodded, accepting the timeline that sealed their fate. An hour and a half to maintain power for 2,200 people. 90 minutes to ensure that rescue ships received accurate distress calls and position information. Less than 2 hours to prove that British engineering could face disaster with dignity and competence. "Gentlemen," Bell said, gathering his engineers around the main control station, "we have the honor of ensuring that this ship dies as magnificently as she lived. Every minute we keep these systems operating gives more people a chance to reach the lifeboats safely." The ship's log lay open beside him, its final entries documenting their systematic response to the unthinkable. Each measurement, each decision, each action would be recorded with the same professional precision that had characterized their entire careers. "Thomas, begin shutting down non-essential systems and redirecting power to emergency lighting," Bell ordered. "Harvey, maintain steam pressure to the generators for as long as physically possible. And remember, we are engineers. We solve problems. Death is simply the final problem we'll solve together." The ROV's lights illuminated a workbench that defied every assumption about panic and chaos during the Titanic's final hours. Sarah Chen stared at the monitor in amazement as the camera revealed a collection of handmade tools arranged with methodical precision, each one crafted during the emergency to solve problems that the ship's original equipment couldn't handle. "Look at this wrench," Morrison whispered, directing Rodriguez to focus the camera on a piece of improvised engineering. Someone took a standard pipe fitting and modified it into a specialized tool. The metalwork is extraordinary. The handmade wrench showed clear evidence of skilled craftsmanship, performed under extreme pressure. File marks indicated where excess metal had been carefully removed, and the grip had been wrapped with cloth to provide better leverage. This wasn't desperate improvisation. This was professional problem-solving applied to impossible circumstances. The modification would have taken at least 20 minutes to complete properly, Rodriguez observed, studying the tool through the camera. Someone took the time to do this right, even knowing the ship was sinking. Sarah felt her understanding of the disaster continuing to evolve as they documented each artifact. These engineers hadn't simply maintained existing systems. They had actively innovated, creating solutions that didn't exist in any manual or training program. Every tool told a story of technical expertise applied under unimaginable pressure. "Here's another one," Rodriguez said, maneuvering the ROV to examine a second workstation. "They've modified a valve wrench to fit connections that weren't designed for standard tools." The camera revealed a collection of improvised implements that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Wrenches had been bent and reshaped to access confined spaces. Handles had been extended using pieces of pipe to provide additional leverage. Every modification showed evidence of careful planning and skilled execution. They were solving engineering problems in real time, Morrison realized, his archaeological training helping him interpret the evidence. Each tool represents a specific challenge they encountered and overcame during the emergency. The ROV discovered a small anvil that had been used to reshape metal components during the disaster. Hammer marks around the workspace indicated extensive fabrication activity, with metal shavings still visible on the deck plates after more than a century underwater. Someone had set up a complete metalworking operation in the flooding engine room. "This changes everything we thought we knew about their final hours," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. They weren't just maintaining systems, they were rebuilding them. Rodriguez positioned the camera to examine a series of pipe fittings that had been completely redesigned during the emergency. The original connections had been abandoned in favor of improvised joints that could handle higher pressures and more flexible routing. The work showed the same professional quality found throughout the engine room. "Look at the precision of these connections," Morrison noted, studying the modified piping. "Every joint is properly sealed and supported. They maintained engineering standards even when facing certain death." The workbench revealed additional evidence of the engineers' creative problem-solving. Spare parts had been cannibalized and repurposed for entirely different applications. Electrical components had been rewired to serve mechanical functions. Metal stock had been shaped into custom fittings that couldn't be found in any parts inventory. They turned this engine room into a complete manufacturing facility, Rodriguez observed. Every skill, every technique they had learned during their careers was applied to keeping this ship operational. The camera focused on a hand-drawn schematic pinned to the workbench, showing modifications to the steam distribution system that had never appeared in any official documentation. The drawing displayed the same professional quality found in the ship's original blueprints, complete with pressure calculations and flow diagrams. Someone took the time to document their modifications properly, Sarah realized. Even knowing they were going to die, they maintained professional standards and left records for anyone who might need to understand their work. The ROV revealed a tool rack, where implements had been organized according to function and frequency of use. Each tool had been positioned for maximum efficiency, with the most critical items placed within easy reach of the main control stations. The organization spoke to minds that remained calm and methodical, despite impossible circumstances. They optimized their workspace for emergency operations, Morrison observed. Every tool placement was calculated to reduce response time during critical repairs. The evidence painted a picture of engineers who had transformed a sinking ship into a platform for technical innovation. Their improvised tools had extended the vessel's operational capability far beyond its design parameters, buying precious time for evacuation operations that would ultimately save hundreds of lives. These men didn't just die at their posts, Sarah said, her voice heavy with emotion. They died solving problems, creating solutions, and proving that human ingenuity can triumph even in the face of certain death. The handmade wrench lay on the workbench exactly where its creator had placed it, a testament to skills that had transcended the limitations of equipment and circumstance. The ROV's camera focused on a series of chalk marks ascending the bulkhead like a grim measuring stick of doom. Sarah Chen realized they were looking at something no historian had ever documented. A real-time record of the Atlantic Ocean's relentless advance into Engine Room No. 6, marked by engineers who had measured their own approaching death with scientific precision. "Those are water level markers," Morrison breathed, his voice filled with horrified fascination. Someone was recording the flood progression throughout the emergency. The chalk marks began at knee height and continued upward in regular intervals, each line accompanied by precise time notations written in a steady hand. 12:15 a.m., 12:30 a.m., 12:45 a.m. The measurements told a story of methodical observation maintained even as death approached with mathematical certainty. They were treating their own disaster like an engineering problem to be solved. Rodriguez observed, maneuvering the ROV for a closer examination. Even facing death, they maintained scientific methodology. The water level markers revealed the flood's progression with terrifying clarity. The initial rise had been gradual, giving the engineers hope that pumping systems might control the damage. But as the marks climbed higher, the intervals between measurements grew shorter, indicating an acceleration that overwhelmed every countermeasure. "Look at the handwriting," Sarah pointed out, studying the timestamps through the camera. It remained steady throughout the progression. Whoever was making these measurements never lost their composure. The chalk marks painted a picture of men who had refused to surrender to panic, even as their workplace transformed into a death trap. Each measurement represented a moment when someone had chosen scientific observation over emotional breakdown, maintaining professional standards until the very end. 1:15 a.m. Rodriguez read from one of the higher marks. The water was chest deep by then, but they were still taking measurements. The ROV discovered additional evidence of the engineers' systematic response to the rising flood. Equipment had been moved to higher positions as water claimed the lower levels. Critical tools were relocated to elevated workbenches. Important documents were transferred to waterproof containers and secured above the advancing waterline. They managed a controlled retreat, Morrison realized. As each level flooded, they consolidated operations at the next highest point. This wasn't panic, this was tactical withdrawal. The camera revealed sandbags that had been positioned around critical electrical equipment, creating temporary barriers against the encroaching water. The work showed clear evidence of planning and coordination, with materials positioned for maximum effectiveness in slowing the flood's advance. These barriers bought them additional operating time, Sarah observed. Every minute they delayed the water's advance was another minute of power for the wireless and emergency lighting. The water level markers continued their relentless climb, documenting the moment when hope shifted to acceptance. The chalk marks near the ceiling showed measurements taken when the engineers were working in neck-deep water, their movements restricted to whatever tasks could be performed while treading water. 1:45 a.m. Rodriguez read from a mark near the overhead pipes. They were still taking measurements when the water was over their heads. The ROV discovered evidence of the engineers' final desperate measures to combat the rising tide. Emergency pumps had been repositioned multiple times as lower stations flooded. Steam lines had been rerouted to higher levels to maintain pressure for critical systems. Every modification showed evidence of systematic thinking applied under impossible circumstances. They turned this engine room into a fortress, Morrison said, his voice filled with admiration. Every barrier, every modification was designed to buy additional operating time. The chalk marks told a story that no survivor account had ever captured. While passengers struggled with lifeboats on the deck above, engineers had been conducting a scientific study of their own destruction, measuring and recording the advance of water that would claim their lives. Look at this final mark. Sarah directed the camera to a notation near the ceiling that read simply, 2:10 a.m. water. At maximum operating level, maintaining emergency power as long as possible. God save the passengers. The message represented the transition from measurement to acceptance, from engineering problem to final prayer. Yet even in those words, the engineers' priorities remained clear. Their last recorded thought was for the people whose lives depended on the systems they maintained. They documented their own death, Rodriguez said quietly. These marks are a scientific record of courage under pressure. The water level markers continued beyond the final notation, indicating that flooding had eventually claimed every inch of the compartment. But the chalk marks themselves had survived, preserved by the cold water and sealed environment that had protected them for over a century. This is the most accurate record of the ship's final moments ever discovered, Morrison realized. These engineers created a timeline that's more precise than any survivor testimony. The ROV's lights illuminated the highest chalk mark, positioned just inches below the overhead pipes where the last engineer had made his final measurement before the water claimed him forever. The ROV's camera revealed something that made Sarah Chen's breath catch in her throat. Carved into a brass pipe fitting with painstaking precision were names and messages that transformed cold metal into a testament of human courage. The engravings were clear, despite over a century underwater, each letter carefully formed by hands that knew they would never hold their loved ones again. Joseph Bell, Chief Engineer. Tell Martha I died thinking of her smile. Rodriguez read slowly as the camera focused on the first inscription. The words had been carved with obvious care, using what appeared to be a precision engraving tool rather than crude scratching. Morrison leaned forward, his archaeological training engaged by this unprecedented discovery. The quality of this engraving is remarkable. Someone took considerable time to create these messages properly, even knowing death was approaching. The brass fitting revealed additional inscriptions as the ROV's lights swept across its surface. Each name was accompanied by a brief message, creating a metal memorial that had survived in the depths of the Atlantic. The engineers had transformed a functional component into a permanent record of their final thoughts. William Harvey, Junior Engineer. Father, I tried to make you proud. Sarah read from the second inscription. The young man's final words to his railway engineer father carried the weight of a family tradition that would end in the cold Atlantic. The camera revealed more engraved messages throughout engine room number 6. Pipe fittings, valve housings, and electrical panels bore the carefully carved testimonies of men who had faced death with dignity and determination. Each inscription showed the same professional quality, suggesting the use of proper engraving tools maintained for this specific purpose. Thomas Andrews sends his regards to his family in Belfast. The ship was built with love. Rodriguez read from an inscription on the main steam distribution manifold. The ship's designer had apparently visited engine room number 6 during the final hours, adding his own message to the engineer's memorial. The engravings painted a picture of men who had used their final hours not just to maintain ship operations, but to create lasting testimonies for the families they would never see again. Each message was carefully composed and expertly executed, showing the same attention to detail that characterized their professional work. Look at this one. Morrison directed the camera to a valve housing near the electrical panel. Henry Thompson, we kept the lights burning until the end. Remember us when you see ships at night. The poetic nature of Thompson's message revealed a man who understood the symbolic importance of their sacrifice. The engineers hadn't just maintained power for practical reasons. They had kept the lights burning as a beacon of hope and human determination against the darkness of disaster. The engraving tools must have been part of their standard equipment, Sarah realized. Engine rooms require precision marking of components and modifications. They used their professional tools to create these final messages. The ROV discovered a concentration of inscriptions around the main control station, where multiple engineers had apparently gathered during their final moments. The messages formed a collective testimony that transformed the mechanical space into a sacred memorial. We stayed because we are engineers. Someone must tend the machines until the end. The engine room watch. Rodriguez read from the largest inscription, carved into the main electrical distribution panel. The collective message spoke to a professional code that transcended personal safety. These men had remained at their posts, not because they were trapped, but because they understood their responsibility to the passengers and crew who depended on the systems they maintained. Each inscription tells a complete story, Morrison observed, documenting the messages for future study. Names, relationships, final thoughts, professional commitments. This is the most comprehensive record of individual experiences during the disaster ever discovered. The camera revealed additional messages carved into less visible surfaces, suggesting that the engineers had continued their memorial work throughout the emergency. Some inscriptions included specific technical information about system modifications, creating a permanent record of their innovations. Edward Smith, engineer, modified electrical system to extend wireless transmission. Look for the copper bundle routing. Sarah read from an inscription hidden behind a control panel. The technical messages revealed that the engineers had been thinking not just of their families, but of future investigators who might need to understand their emergency modifications. They had created an instruction manual carved in metal, ensuring their innovations wouldn't be lost. This transforms Engine Room Number 6 into the most important archaeological site in maritime history, Morrison said, his voice filled with awe. These inscriptions provide first-hand accounts of the disaster from the people who kept the ship operational during its final hours. The engraved pipe fitting gleamed under the ROV's lights, its brass surface bearing witness to courage that had transcended death itself. Each carefully formed letter represented a moment when human dignity had triumphed over despair, when professional pride had overcome personal fear, when love had found a way to bridge the gap between life and death. April 15, 1912, 2:05 a.m. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell watched the main electrical panel as voltage readings fluctuated wildly across the gauges. The burned electrical panel that would survive for over a century bore witness to these final moments when human determination collided with the immutable laws of physics and salt water. Steam pressure dropping in Boiler Room 5. Harvey called out, his voice steady despite the waist-deep water that now filled the lower levels. I'm shutting down that section and rerouting remaining pressure to the emergency generators. Bell nodded grimly, knowing that each system shutdown brought them closer to total power failure. But every minute they maintained electrical output meant another minute of wireless transmission, another minute of emergency lighting, another minute for the lifeboats to clear the ship safely. Thomas, how long can we maintain current on the wireless circuits? Bell asked, consulting the readings on his pocket watch that would stop forever at 2:17 a.m. Perhaps 10 more minutes, if we sacrifice all other systems, came the reply from the junior engineer, working frantically at the rerouting panel. I can give them everything we have left, but it means working in complete darkness. Bell made the decision that would define their final moments. Do it. Cut power to all compartment lighting, all passenger areas, all non-essential systems. Route everything to the wireless room and emergency signals. The burned electrical panel flickered as massive current loads were redirected through circuits never designed to handle such power. Sparks flew from overloaded connections as the engineers pushed their improvised systems beyond all safety margins. They were burning out the ship's electrical heart to squeeze every possible second of transmission time. Sir, Harvey called from his position at the steam valves. Water is beginning to reach the main generators. We'll lose all power within minutes. Bell looked around Engine Room Number 6, taking in the scene that would remain frozen in time for over a century. His engineers continued working at their stations, even as Atlantic water swirled around their chests. Tools remained precisely positioned. Gauges were monitored until the last moment. Professional standards were maintained even as death approached. "Gentlemen," Bell announced, his voice carrying clearly through the flooding compartment, "we have done everything possible. The ship has had power for over 2 hours since the collision. We have exceeded every expectation and surpassed every design specification." The main electrical panel erupted in a shower of sparks as seawater finally reached the primary distribution circuits. The burned connections that would puzzle investigators for decades were created in this moment when saltwater met high-voltage electricity in a final surge of power. "Wireless is still transmitting," Thomas reported from his emergency position near the ceiling-mounted backup systems. "I can hear the spark gap operating. Phillips is still sending the distress call." Bell felt a surge of professional pride as he realized their jury-rig systems were continuing to function even after main power failed. The copper wire bundles they had installed were drawing current from emergency batteries, maintaining communication when standard electrical systems had surrendered to the flood. "How much longer?" Bell asked, though he already knew the answer from watching the water level rise around them. "Perhaps 5 more minutes," Thomas replied. "The backup batteries are nearly drained, and I'll lose access to the controls soon." Bell opened his pocket Bible to Psalm 23, the same passage that would be found in Engine Room No. 6 over a century later. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he read aloud for his men, his voice calm and steady despite their circumstances. The final power surge came at 2:17 a.m., when the last emergency circuits failed catastrophically. The burned electrical panel documented this moment, with melted connections and charred components that would survive as evidence of the engineers' final desperate efforts to maintain power. "That's it," Thomas called out as the last lights flickered and died. "Complete electrical failure. The wireless has gone silent." Bell felt the ship shudder as the final generators shut down, plunging Titanic into the total darkness that had claimed the North Atlantic for millennia before electric light had challenged its dominion. But even in that darkness, he felt a sense of completion rather than defeat. "We kept our promise," he said to his men, though his words were barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "Every passenger who reaches safety will owe their lives partly to the power we maintained. Every distress call that brought rescue ships was transmitted using electricity we provided." The burned electrical panel sparked one final time as residual charge dissipated through saltwater flooded circuits, creating the damage patterns that would tell their story to future generations. Then Engine Room No. 6 fell silent, except for the gentle sound of water, claiming the last airspaces near the ceiling. Bell's pocket watch stopped at 2:17 a.m., marking the exact moment when human ingenuity finally surrendered to the Atlantic Ocean. The ROV's camera focused on an open logbook that defied every law of preservation. The exploration team thought they understood. Sarah Chen stared at the monitor in amazement, as legible handwriting appeared on pages that should have been destroyed decades ago by saltwater and time. The final entry, written in complete darkness, revealed the engineer's last recorded thoughts. "The ink is still visible," Morrison whispered, his voice filled with scientific wonder. "After 112 years underwater, we can still read what they wrote in their final moments." The logbook lay open on the main control station, positioned as if someone had just finished writing. Rodriguez maneuvered the ROV carefully, ensuring the camera captured every detail of the remarkable preservation that had protected this final testimony from the deep Atlantic. The 15th of April, 1912, 2:20 a.m. Power failure. Complete. Wireless silent. "We remain at our posts," Rodriguez read from the clearly visible text. Signed, J. Bell, Chief Engineer, W. Harvey, Junior Engineer, T. Andrews, Ship Designer. The final entry transformed their understanding of the disaster's timeline. The engineers had continued working for several minutes after complete electrical failure, maintaining their duties even when their technical skills could no longer affect the outcome. Their commitment transcended the practical requirements of their positions. "Look at the penmanship," Sarah observed, studying the handwriting through the camera. Despite writing in total darkness, in rising water, facing certain death, the script remained steady and professional. The logbook's preservation represented a minor miracle of deep-sea archaeology. The leather binding had created a sealed environment that protected the pages from the worst effects of saltwater corrosion. The engineers' final words had survived in pristine condition, waiting over a century to tell their story. Water level at ceiling. Maintaining watch until relieved. God save the passengers and crew. Morrison read from the logbook's final paragraph. We die as we lived, in service to our ship and those who depend upon us. The entry revealed men who had maintained military-style discipline until their final breath. Even facing certain death, they had followed proper procedures, documented their actions, and awaited relief that would never come. Their commitment to duty had transcended personal survival instincts. This is the most important maritime document ever discovered, Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with the magnitude of their find. These are the actual final words of the men who kept Titanic operational during the disaster. The ROV discovered additional evidence of the engineers' final positions throughout engine room number 6. Tools had been placed with obvious care at their proper stations. Equipment had been secured according to standard procedures. Everything suggested that these men had prepared their workplace for inspection, maintaining professional standards until their final moments. They arranged everything as if they expected their relief watch to arrive, Sarah realized, studying the perfectly organized workspace. Even knowing they were going to die, they maintained proper engineering protocols. The logbook's pages revealed additional entries written during the emergency, documenting the engineers' systematic response to each developing crisis. Steam pressure readings, electrical load calculations, and pump operation schedules were recorded with the same precision that characterized routine watch duties. Look at these technical notations. Morrison pointed to detailed measurements recorded throughout the emergency. They continued documenting system performance even as the ship was sinking. This is invaluable data about the disaster's progression. The camera revealed personal messages written in the logbook's margins, where individual engineers had added their own final thoughts. These informal notations provided intimate glimpses into the minds of men facing death with remarkable composure and dignity. My wife, Martha. I kept my promise to come home safely in my heart, even if not in body. The children must remember their father died serving others. J. Bell. Rodriguez read from handwriting squeezed into a narrow margin. The logbook's final pages contained technical diagrams, showing the emergency modifications they had implemented during the disaster. The drawings were executed with the same professional quality found in the ship's original blueprints, creating a permanent record of their innovations. They documented their emergency procedures for future engineers, Sarah realized. Even in their final moments, they were thinking about improving maritime safety for others who might face similar disasters. The preservation of the logbook provided unprecedented insight into the disaster's human dimension. These weren't just statistics or technical failures, but real people making conscious choices to maintain their professional responsibilities, despite impossible circumstances. The final entry is dated 3 minutes after we thought all power failed, Morrison observed, studying the timestamps. They continued working by feel and memory when they could no longer see their instruments. The open logbook lay exactly where Chief Engineer Bell had placed it after making his final entry, a testament to organizational habits that persisted even in the face of death. The precise positioning spoke to minds that remained methodical and professional until their final breath. This logbook represents the most complete record of heroism under pressure ever discovered, Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. These men transformed their final moments into a lesson in courage and professional dedication that will inspire engineers for generations. The ROV's lights revealed something that struck the exploration team into stunned silence. Arranged in a careful circle near the main electrical panel were 7 pieces of coal, each one positioned with obvious intention and reverence. Sarah Chen realized they were looking at a makeshift memorial created by the engineers themselves, honoring colleagues who had already died at their posts. "It's a memorial," Morrison whispered, his voice filled with awe. They took the time to create a monument for their fallen comrades, even as they faced their own deaths. The stones were arranged with military precision, forming a perfect circle around a central object that the camera couldn't quite identify. Rodriguez maneuvered the ROV closer, revealing that the memorial's centerpiece was a brass nameplate carefully removed from one of the ship's control panels. "Look at the inscription," Rodriguez said, as the camera focused on the central nameplate, RMS Titanic, Engine Room Number 6, in memory of those who stayed. The makeshift memorial told a story that no survivor account had ever captured. Some engineers had apparently died earlier in the emergency, possibly from steam scalding or electrical shock, and their surviving colleagues had honored them with this simple but profound tribute. The positioning is deliberate, Sarah observed, studying the arrangement through the camera. Each stone represents a specific person. This isn't random placement. It's a carefully planned monument. The coal pieces had been selected for uniformity, each one approximately the same size and shape. Someone had taken considerable time to choose appropriate stones and arrange them in a pattern that would honor the dead while providing comfort to the living during their own final hours. Coal was the heart of this ship's power, Morrison realized. They chose pieces of the fuel that drove Titanic as memorial stones for the men who tended her engines. It's symbolically perfect. The ROV discovered additional evidence of the memorial's creation throughout the engine room. Tools had been used to shape the coal pieces into more regular forms. A work area showed coal dust and shavings, where someone had carefully prepared each memorial stone to exact specifications. This represents hours of work, Rodriguez observed, studying the evidence of the memorial's construction. Someone spent precious time during the emergency, creating this tribute, instead of attempting to save themselves. The memorial's placement near the main electrical panel suggested it had been positioned where the surviving engineers could see it during their final duties. The arrangement provided both inspiration and comfort, reminding them that their sacrifice would be remembered and honored by those who understood the true cost of their dedication. They turned this engine room into a cathedral, Sarah said, her voice heavy with emotion. This memorial transforms the space from a workplace into a sacred site. The camera revealed additional memorial elements throughout the compartment. Personal effects from deceased colleagues had been arranged respectfully near their former workstations. Tools were positioned as if their owners had just stepped away, creating shrines that honored both the men and their professional dedication. Look at this. Morrison directed the ROV to focus on a collection of personal items arranged near the steam gauges. Someone's pocket watch, a photograph, and a wedding ring. These belonged to an engineer who died earlier, and his colleagues created a memorial at his station. The makeshift memorial revealed the depth of camaraderie among the engineering crew. These men hadn't just worked together, they had formed bonds of brotherhood that transcended professional relationships, creating a family bound by shared commitment to their ship and passengers. The memorial stones are positioned to be visible from every workstation, Rodriguez observed, studying the arrangement through multiple camera angles. No matter where the surviving engineers were working, they could see this tribute to their fallen comrades. The coal memorial provided insight into the engineers' mental state during their final hours. Instead of despair or panic, they had found strength in honoring their colleagues and maintaining the traditions of maritime service that had defined their careers. This changes our understanding of their final hours completely, Sarah realized. They weren't just waiting to die, they were actively creating meaning, building memorials, and ensuring their sacrifice would be remembered with dignity. The memorial's construction had required cooperation among multiple survivors, suggesting that the remaining engineers had worked together to honor their colleagues even as their own death approached. The project represented a collective act of remembrance and hope. They believed their memorial would survive, Morrison said, his voice filled with wonder. Somehow, they knew that Engine Room Number 6 would be preserved and that future generations would find this tribute to their fallen colleagues. The makeshift memorial gleamed under the ROV's lights, its carefully arranged stones bearing witness to brotherhood that had transcended death itself. Each piece of coal represented not just a fallen comrade, but a commitment to honor and remember that had survived 112 years beneath the Atlantic Ocean. This is the most moving archaeological discovery in maritime history, Sarah whispered, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than technical artifacts or historical evidence. They were seeing love made manifest in stone and time. The ROV's manipulator arm carefully lifted a metal plate that had been positioned with obvious intention near the engine room's main entrance. Sarah Chen watched in amazement as the camera revealed an etched testimony that transformed their understanding of the engineer's final hours. This wasn't just another inscription. It was a complete final testament, carved with meticulous care into a piece of steel that would survive as their voice from the deep. "This is extraordinary," Morrison breathed, studying the detailed etching through the monitor. "Someone spent hours creating this testimony. Look at the precision of every letter." The metal plate measured approximately 12 inches square, its surface covered with text that had been carefully planned and executed with professional engraving tools. Every word was perfectly formed, creating a document that rivaled printed text in its clarity and precision. "To those who find this record," Rodriguez read slowly as the camera focused on the opening lines, "we, the engineers of RMS Titanic, leave this testament to our final hours. We remained at our posts, not from duty alone, but from love for those whose lives depended upon our service." The testimony continued across the metal surface, revealing thoughts and emotions that no historical record had ever captured. These weren't hurried scratches carved in panic, but carefully composed words that had been planned, drafted, and executed with the same attention to detail that characterized their professional work. "We understand that our families will grieve our loss, but we hope they will find comfort in knowing we faced death as we lived, in service to others and with dignity intact." Sarah read from the next section, her voice barely steady. The metal plate testimony revealed the engineers' thoughts about their families, their profession, and their final sacrifice. Each paragraph was perfectly composed, suggesting that multiple drafts had been written before the final version was etched into permanent metal. "Look at this section about their technical innovations." Morrison pointed to a detailed paragraph describing their emergency modifications. "They documented every system change, every improvised solution, every innovation they created during the emergency." The testimony included specific technical information that would prove invaluable to future maritime engineers. Electrical load calculations, steam pressure modifications, and pump operation procedures were described in detail, creating a manual of emergency engineering that had never existed before. "We modified the electrical distribution system to extend wireless transmission by approximately 18 minutes beyond normal operational limits," Rodriguez read from the technical section. "Future engineers should note that emergency battery systems can be paralleled with main generators to achieve extended operation during catastrophic flooding." The level of technical detail revealed men who were thinking not just of their immediate circumstances, but of future emergencies that other engineers might face. They had transformed their disaster into a learning opportunity, documenting innovations that could save lives in future maritime emergencies. "The professional terminology is remarkable," Sarah observed. "Even facing death, they maintained proper engineering language and documentation standards." The testimony's personal sections revealed the depth of character that had motivated their sacrifice. Messages to wives, children, and parents were interwoven with professional observations, creating a complete picture of men who saw no separation between their personal values and professional responsibilities. "To our wives, we kept our marriage vows to love and protect until death parted us. To our children, remember that your fathers chose honor over survival. To our profession, we maintained engineering standards until our final breath," Morrison read from a section that brought tears to his eyes. The metal plate revealed that multiple engineers had contributed to the testimony, with different handwriting styles visible in various sections. Yet, the overall composition showed careful coordination and editing, suggesting they had worked together to create a collective final statement. "This section describes their decision-making process," Rodriguez noted, focusing the camera on a paragraph that explained their choice to remain at their posts. They could have attempted to reach the lifeboats, but chose to maintain power for as long as possible. The testimony included detailed timing information that provided the most accurate record of the disaster's progression ever discovered. Power system failures, flooding rates, and operational decisions were documented with precise timestamps that filled gaps in the historical record. "We calculate that our extended power operations allowed the wireless to transmit distress calls for an additional 23 minutes, beyond normal system capabilities," Sarah read from the technical analysis section. This additional transmission time ensured multiple rescue vessels received accurate position information. The final section of the testimony contained their hopes for how their sacrifice would be remembered and honored. The engineers had explicitly requested that their story serve as inspiration for future maritime professionals and as comfort for their families. "We die not as victims, but as engineers who fulfilled our highest calling," May our sacrifice inspire others to choose service over self-preservation. And may our families find pride in our final actions. Rodriguez read from the closing paragraph. The metal plate gleamed under the ROV's lights, its carefully etched surface bearing witness to courage that had found its voice in steel and time. Dr. Sarah Chen held the salvage name badge in her hands as the submersible Orpheus began its slow ascent from the ocean floor. The brass plate, bearing Joseph Bell's identification, had been carefully extracted from engine room number 6, representing the only artifact they would bring to the surface from the sacred space below. The decision to disturb anything in that underwater cathedral had been agonizing, but the badge would serve as a tangible connection between the engineer's sacrifice and the modern world. Beginning ascent, Rodriguez announced, his voice subdued by the emotional weight of their discoveries. 2 hours to surface. The name badge felt warm in Sarah's hands, despite the submersible's climate control, as if it still retained some essence of the man who had worn it during those final heroic hours. The metal was perfectly preserved, its engraving still crisp after 112 years underwater. J. Bell, Chief Engineer, RMS Titanic. We're carrying their voices back to the world, Morrison said quietly, studying the extensive documentation they had compiled during their exploration. Engine room number 6 will never be the same kind of secret again. The ROV Surveyor was secured in its cradle, its memory banks filled with thousands of images that would revolutionize understanding of the Titanic disaster. Every inscription, every modified tool, every piece of evidence had been meticulously documented to ensure their discoveries could be shared with historians, engineers, and the families of those who had perished. The memorial stones will remain exactly where the engineers placed them, Sarah said, her voice firm with conviction. Some things are too sacred to disturb. Engine room No. 6 should stay as they arranged it, a monument to their courage. The ascent through 2 miles of water provided time for the team to process what they had witnessed in the depths. The engineer's final hours had been revealed, not as a period of helpless waiting, but as a masterclass in professional dedication and human courage under impossible circumstances. The technical innovations alone will change maritime safety protocols, Rodriguez observed, consulting the detailed measurements they had recorded. Their emergency electrical modifications, the jury-rigged communication systems, the systematic flood management. Modern engineers need to study what they accomplished. Morrison reviewed the photographic evidence of the engraved testimonies, ensuring that every message carved in metal had been properly documented. The engineers' own words would finally reach the families who had waited over a century for news of their loved ones' final moments. This name badge represents all of them, Sarah said, looking at Bell's identification plate. When we present this to the Maritime Museum, it will carry the stories of every man who stayed in that engine room. The weight of responsibility pressed down on the exploration team as they realized their discoveries would reshape historical understanding of the disaster. The engineers hadn't been passive victims of circumstance, but active heroes who had extended the ship's operational life far beyond its designed capabilities. We need to handle this information carefully, Morrison cautioned. These revelations will be painful for some families, but healing for others. The world deserves to know the truth about their sacrifice. The submersible's lights played across the dark water as they rose through the depths, leaving behind the resting place of men who had chosen duty over survival. Engine room No. 6 would continue its silent vigil on the ocean floor, protected by the crushing pressure and eternal darkness that had preserved it for over a century. The engraved testimonies need to be shared exactly as we found them, Sarah decided. No interpretation, no editorial comment. These men earned the right to speak for themselves. Rodriguez monitored their ascent rate, ensuring a gradual return to surface pressure that would protect both the crew and their precious cargo. The name badge represented the first artifact recovered from engine room No. 6, but it would also be the last. Future expeditions would observe and document, but never again disturb the memorial the engineers had created. Their families deserved to know how they died, Morrison said, thinking of the descendants who had wondered for generations about their ancestors' final moments. Not just that they stayed at their posts, but how they transformed their workplace into a monument to professional excellence. The ascent continued through water that gradually changed from the absolute black of the deep ocean to the dark blue of intermediate depths. Far above, the research vessel Meridian, weighted with communication equipment that would carry news of their discoveries to a world that had never known the full story of the engineers' heroism. "We're bringing more than artifacts to the surface," Sarah realized. "We're carrying proof that human courage can transcend any disaster, that professional dedication can survive even death itself." The salvage name badge caught the submersible's interior lighting, its brass surface reflecting the commitment to honor and remember that would guide their efforts to share the engineers' stories with future generations. The memorial plaque gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as Dr. Sarah Chen unveiled it before the gathered crowd at the National Maritime Museum. 6 months had passed since their return from the depths of the North Atlantic, and the bronze tribute represented the culmination of efforts to honor the engineers who had given their lives in Engine Room Number 6, in memory of Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and the engineers of RMS Titanic, who maintained power and hope until their final breath. Sarah read from the inscription as photographers captured the moment for posterity. The plaque bore the names of all 35 engineers who had perished with the ship, but special recognition was given to the 5 men whose final hours had been documented in Engine Room Number 6. Their stories had transformed public understanding of the disaster, revealing heroes whose sacrifice had enabled the rescue of over 700 survivors. These men didn't just die at their posts. Morrison addressed the assembled crowd of maritime professionals, historians, and descendants of Titanic's crew. They innovated, improvised, and extended the ship's operational life far beyond what anyone thought possible. The bronze memorial was positioned overlooking Portsmouth Harbor, where ships of all sizes carried the legacy of improved safety standards that had been directly influenced by the engineers' final testimonies. Their documented innovations had been incorporated into modern emergency procedures, ensuring their technical knowledge would continue saving lives. The emergency electrical modifications they developed have become standard protocol for maritime disaster response, announced Captain Rebecca Hayes of the International Maritime Organization. Their sacrifice continues to protect sailors and passengers around the world. Joseph Bell's salvage name badge was mounted at the Memorial Center, the brass plate serving as a tangible connection to the men whose courage had transcended death itself. The artifact had become a pilgrimage destination for engineers and maritime professionals who understood the true cost of keeping ships operational during emergencies. Every time a ship's crew maintains power during an emergency, they honor the memory of Engine Room Number 6. Sarah explained to the documentary crew recording the memorial dedication. These engineers created a template for heroism that continues to inspire maritime professionals. The memorial's unveiling coincided with new international safety regulations that required all passenger vessels to carry enhanced emergency communication equipment. The engineers' jury-rigged wireless extensions had demonstrated the critical importance of extended transmission capability during disasters. The 18 additional minutes of wireless transmission they provided meant the difference between rescue and tragedy for hundreds of people, noted Dr. Robert Ballard, who had participated in the memorial's design. Their technical innovation under pressure saved more lives than they could have imagined. Families of the engineers had traveled from around the world to attend the memorial dedication. Martha Bell's great-granddaughter, now 87 years old, placed a wreath at the base of the bronze plaque, fulfilling a promise her family had carried for over a century. "My great-grandmother never remarried," she said through tears of both grief and pride. She said Joseph was still serving his ship, and she would wait for him to complete his final voyage. The memorial plaque's design incorporated elements from Engine Room Number 6, including replicas of the coal memorial stones, and quotes from the engraved testimonies the engineers had left behind. Their own words served as their eternal epitaph, more powerful than any tribute others could compose. "We die not as victims, but as engineers who fulfilled our highest calling." Morrison read from the inscription that captured the essence of their sacrifice. These words transformed tragedy into triumph, death into inspiration. The dedication ceremony concluded with the lighting of an eternal flame that would burn in memory of all maritime engineers who had chosen duty over survival. The flame was fed by natural gas from the same North Sea fields that now powered modern ships, creating a symbolic connection between past sacrifice and future safety. Engine Room No. 6 remains undisturbed on the ocean floor, Sarah announced to the gathered crowd. It will continue serving as an underwater memorial, protecting the evidence of courage that we discovered there. The bronze memorial caught the late afternoon sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the faces of people who had gathered to honor men they would never meet, but whose sacrifice had touched their lives across more than a century. The engineers' legacy lived not just in metal and stone, but in the continued commitment to maritime safety that their example had inspired. "They kept the lights burning," Sarah said in closing, her voice carrying across the harbor where modern ships pass safely thanks to innovations born from disaster. "And they keep burning still, in every emergency protocol, every safety regulation, every maritime professional who chooses service over self-preservation." The memorial plaque would stand as eternal witness to the truth that courage can survive any disaster, that professional dedication can transcend death itself, and that the human spirit, properly applied, can transform even tragedy into lasting triumph.